So welcome everyone. As Jake said, my name is April from Labster, and we are absolutely delighted to have you join us today for this conversation. I'd like to give you a short introduction to our Labster platform, just as some background for Dr. Alevras's presentation. Labster is an immersive environment where learners put themselves right in the middle of a high-end science lab. They're guided through the lab, presented with notes on theory, and given an opportunity to do authentic experiments that relate to real-world challenges, helping them exercise what they've learned in their lectures and from their course material. There are over 300 science simulations available in our catalog that you can pick and choose from to match to your courses. Now, Labster was created to engage and enable students with equitable access to lifelike scenarios where they can learn, practice, try things out, maybe fail a little, try again until they succeed. And as many of you know well, the time that college students get to spend doing real, authentic, hands-on work can be rather limited, especially the amount of time they get to spend in more expensive science labs. Students today live their lives in what is unquestionably a digital world. And whether we like it or not, instructors have to compete for attention among all of students' other priorities. This is evident in their shorter attention spans, often resulting in lower engagement and lower grades. At Labster, we believe that one of the best ways to get students engaged is to meet them where they are on their own terms, giving them the tools that allow them to prepare, practice, learn from their mistakes, and do it all in an immersive environment that's fun and familiar and sparks their curiosity for what's next. And speaking of what's next, I'd like to pause here and invite Dr. Alevras to take us along on her journey through engaging the physiology classroom with science simulations. So, Christina, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you very much, April, and thank you very much, Jacob. I'm so excited to be here today because I love talking about my classes and what I'm doing, and I'm just excited to share a little bit about my journey here today with simulations. Actually, April, if you can switch to the next slide. Just a little bit about me before we begin. I am an assistant professor at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, Connecticut. I've been there for close to 20 years now, and it's been an absolute blessing from the beginning until now. I've enjoyed my experience there. I teach typically anatomy and physiology 1 and 2 for the biology folks, but also a couple of non-science majors courses. And I feel like being there, being part of that community and the USJ campus has afforded me this opportunity to just learn and evolve as an educator. And I think that's why I'm so excited about today to just talk about my experiences a little bit and hopefully also engage with you folks and hear from you and some of your experiences as well. So just a little bit before I begin, my teaching philosophy is my goal is to basically serve as a guide for my students, right? I want them to have as much support as possible as they transition from their role as student to their role as clinician. And in that scope of things, I really do believe that the best way to disseminate content is by engaging active learning and as many strategies as I can to really engage the student and hopefully enable for content retention. And so this is why I wanted to talk a little bit about simulations today, because I found them truly helpful, a really big asset to my courses. So let's get started. I wanted to talk a little bit first so you all know just the scope of A&P at St. Joe's. So the USJ was a small, was originally at its inception a small all-women's college. We slowly transitioned into co-ed university. We pride ourselves on small classrooms still, even though we have this university status. A&P and a few other service courses like micro and the intro bio courses are those that we consider to be highly enrolled at about 40 to 45 students in a class, in a section. And so anatomy and physiology 1 and 2, it runs throughout the scope of a year. One academic year is how long I've been pretty much blessed to have my cohort of students work with me. The students that are enrolled in A&P 1 and 2 are typically pre-med, pre-vet, pre-farm, pre-PA, as well as pre-nursing. And so my constant goal is that experiential learning, because this is a foundational year for them as they're progressing towards their ultimate step, which is becoming a clinician. One of the what I'm doing here today and talking about these simulations is basically to just share in my experiences about a deficit that I was finding, and my colleagues that were co-teaching with me were finding in anatomy and physiology. And, it's funny because we can always collaborate with one another. And I was chatting throughout the past several years with colleagues at other universities that were experiencing kind of the same deficit. And that was with discussing, not just discussing, but integrating wholeheartedly physiology in the laboratory. So it's wonderful to do that in lecture, right? You can do that in so many different modalities in lecture. But one area that I was finding to be particularly challenging was to integrate the P in physiology in A&P in the lab. And there were a couple of reasons why. My lab space, my anatomy lab, is a little bit small. It comfortably seats about 10 to 16 students per lab section. So there isn't so much space there to afford us, equipment to engage in the physiological portion of the course. And even if we did have the space, the other problem that I was continuously encountering was this the cost of the equipment. It was really too far reaching in terms of affordability for our university. But I was still thinking, well, there's got to be a way, right? There's got to be a way to engage the students in physiological practice in the laboratory. And so a few years back, as I continued to, progress one semester into the next in A&P, it was on the forefront of my brain. And so I decided to think about other possibilities. Okay, if I don't have the space and if I don't have the equipment in the laboratory setting, how else can I help my learners? Can I support them in their grasp of physiology in the laboratory? So this is where I started to really engage in interviews, if you will, with various companies to see about simulations. What else can I do to help, right? And so it was interesting. It was fun. I was able to really, dissect out what various companies have to offer in terms of simulations and how that would be, if it would be a good fit for what I wanted to do in the laboratory. And I had decided on, okay, Labster. It worked. It seemed to be a good fit in terms of, the minimal requirements for technology. And so I thought, okay, let me just give this a try and see how it's going to work. My initial intent, so this was before COVID, my initial intent was to make this integration slow and deliberate and see how it goes, because, it might run wonderfully and it might not. And, we just have to try things and trial by error, right? And see how they go and then progress from there. But then COVID hit. Right. And so that spring semester, when I had finally decided on this particular platform for my simulations, over the course of a weekend, as we all know, a weekend or so, we all underwent some major changes in our lives in spring 2020. I'm sure that you have all experienced that same, worry, scrambling, and at times despair over what to do, because our courses hadn't stopped in the spring. We were just shifting and pivoting from one platform to another, from fully on campus to spring 2020 fully remote. And so it's truly over that weekend that I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to integrate these simulations because I am expecting myself to come up with a plan that will allow my students this as equitable as of an experience online as they would have in person. And so that's when I really went full force with Labster and integrating these simulations in the lab. And so these simulations allowed me to transition quickly, transition as effortlessly as possible in light of this global pandemic that was looming over our heads. And it gave me the comfort and the realization that I was doing the best I could to engage my students. And so this progressed, we progressed quite quickly in almost, I felt like learning more how to cope in transition rather than in stable times. And so we went from fully remote to over the summer and in the fall, what the university adopted the high flex modality, and which afforded us this ability to do some social distancing at the time. And so I continued to utilize Labster to fortify my course with physiology. And if you don't mind, April, switching on. So now, if you think about these simulations, I wanted to talk, I don't want to focus my talk on COVID, but the underlying scope of my intention before the pandemic hit, which was, how can I fill this? How can I resolve this deficit in my laboratory, right? The space and the cost are big factors that were not allowing me to feel as comfortable as I would have with the physiology that I was doing in the lab. And so simulations, I found, really did resolve those issues. This platform in particular was wonderful for me as far as really offering a true to life experience, application of the content that we were learning in lecture. And of course, it was really terrific that the added benefit that we didn't need to purchase any equipment, which was wonderful in terms of our ability to pivot over that weekend of COVID. So these simulations I found are really helpful in doing that, critical thinking and engaging the learner in the application of the concepts that we were covering in lecture. Before I integrated simulations into my laboratory, I really truly found that the anatomy was adequately and phenomenally covered, but this deficit was still looming. And so I found that this was a good solution for that problem. And if you don't mind moving on. So I wanted to share a little bit about how I utilize simulations in the lab. I've learned a lot on my journey here, and that's part of why I wanted to share this, because nothing is seamless, of course. I think part of the exciting part of having a journey like this is that it's not seamless. It's not easy. So you can learn from your mistakes and move forward and really provide a robust learning experience for your students, and also share with that with your colleagues. And so I really kind of modified how I taught with simulations from one semester to the next. I will admit that the first semester, spring 2020, I was just trying to get all of us successfully through and helping my students to cope. And in many ways, they helped me cope too. But afterwards, when I was able to establish a new comfort zone and a new normal, I was able to, I was afforded the time to really play with my platform that I had selected and figure out the best way to disseminate the content. And so I realized that these simulations were an asset for my students because they were allowing them to engage. They were allowing them to play, to feel comfortable in making mistakes. I purposely set my sims so that they could be low stakes activities so that they could just gain comfort without so much worrying about the grade looming in the background. The way that I set my sims for the laboratories was that they were able to still continuously engage in anatomy with their colleagues in the laboratory. They work together in groups on histology, anatomy, dissections, whatever the case would be, with each new week of lab activities. And that was a skill that I wanted them to hone in and develop, this ability to work and collaborate with others. But at the same time, I did want them to become more comfortable with making their own decisions and also making their own mistakes and figuring out their ways, the best way to resolve those mistakes. And that's where these simulations help me do that. So the way that I assigned them was, okay, you're working with your colleagues in the laboratory. At home, you're going to work on these simulations. And low stake, they would work on them, they would resolve them. These simulations in particular, I liked because they would allow the student to make a mistake without allowing them to keep moving forward and perpetuating the mistake. So the students were able to run through the simulations and really figure out where they were going wrong, learn how to correct it before moving forward. And that was a handful of skills that I find so important that do directly translate into their clinical setting later. Being comfortable, being able to make these decisions, and gaining the independence and the foresight to say, I'm doing this and I'm doing it well. So if you don't mind moving on to the next one. So, of course, obviously during COVID, simulations were an asset. I was literally in the trenches the weekend after we all went home with my colleague, the lab coordinator at USJ in the bio department, and my provost. And we were using meter sticks and measuring out the distance for the students to safely participate in the laboratory at a social distance that was appropriate at the time. However, what really I found to my benefit at the time was the fact that the lab sessions that we ran didn't need to be changed. I was still able to run the same lab sections per week. There were no additional needs for additional folks to hire over the course of a few weeks, which could have been very challenging for the university and for myself coordinating the course. So we could run with our modality as is and still engage those students at home in these simulations. And that was all fine during COVID, but we're now past that. And so I wanted to see, when I had finally the time and the foresight to sit and process, once the dust settled, how were these simulations helping or impacting in general my course? And so that's when I started looking at the numbers to see if, in fact, I wanted to continue with using simulations. Were they filling that void that I had that I was trying to resolve before the pandemic hit, or was this just a great fix for that, albeit a temporary one? And so I wanted to really look at the numbers and see where I was at, because I am very data driven. And I wanted to see if, in fact, the data would substantiate or justify ongoing integration of simulations in the laboratory. And so I did that. I played with the numbers a little bit, and I really wanted to see what the data told me. And if you don't mind, April, going to the next slide, what I realized was that these simulations were helpful not just in resolving the temporary problem that the world was facing, but they were affording me this opportunity to engage my students in experiential learning. These students are enrolled in my course because they're headed into a clinical future where they are working hands-on, face-to-face with patients. And these simulations were allowing them to have that experience in a very comfortable environment and learn from those experiences before they saw their patients. And I wanted to put up this slide on purpose because I just was excited about the plethora of simulations that were that I had to choose from. And once the pandemic was kind of in our past, I was able to play and see, geez, which ones would be more or less appropriate for my audience, for the students that were enrolled in A&P. And I saw that, in fact, simulations are a good faith way to really fill those deficits in terms of content that we typically wouldn't be able to adequately cover in the lab beforehand, at least at a collegiate level, right, with minimal funding. And so I put up this slide on purpose because some of the simulations that I really do appreciate, that I enjoy, and I have found from the student responses they do as well, are right here. Endocrine physiology. I weave the endocrine system through all of A&P2. It is the first topic that I discuss in A&P2, and then I continuously revisit it throughout the whole semester to emphasize it's our ability to manipulate the endocrine system medically, pharmacologically, in order to treat patients. And what I found was that these simulations were able to couple very well with my intent on doing that. Nutrition is another topic that I really do weave through my courses, and these simulations really worked well with that to emphasize the need, the holistic care of your patients. It's not just about pharmacological admin to treat a condition, but it's this holistic mentality that I'm trying to put forth with my students when they're treating their patients. And these simulations afforded me the ability to do that. My favorite one, I have to say, is the hematology simulation. That's why I put it up here because, before teaching with simulations, I would pull up a CBC and have my students analyze it, look at the numbers, see what it told them. But this simulation allowed them to get the full experience from working with a quote unquote patient in the simulation, drawing the blood, running the CBC, analyzing the CBC, communicating the results back to the patient. So it really allowed for an amplified full-on experience.
I love hearing that the hematology sim is one of your favorites. And so, today I want to say anyone who is registered or even viewing this presentation later on, if you want to reach out to Labster, we will make that hematology simulation a free trial for you to just play around with and see what you think.
And I like the phrase play around with, April, because I think that's really important that, when we're trying something new in our courses, it might work out great, it might not, but I think the initial, at least for me, my initial plan is always to just put a new hat on, the role of student, wear the student hat, and really just try to play with what I'm trying to utilize, and see how it's going to work for me in the student's chair. And, I found that I was able to do that with these simulations and really just experience it from the student's scope and perspective. Something else that I found challenging to teach, and again, I'm sure you all have your sticking points, but the nervous system for me it has always been a challenge to communicate to my students, right? Discussing the action potential and how it works in the brain, and a full scope appreciation of that is really hard to do on a whiteboard. And as excited as I am about teaching it, the students aren't always as responsive as I am about the content. But seeing the nervous system and the action potential and these neurodegenerative diseases come to life, if you will, through a simulation is kind of a great way for the students to really engage and appreciate what it is that's happening on a neurological level. And it was always a challenge to do that in the classroom. And these simulations have really, toppled a lot of those barriers and sticking points. And so, April, if you don't mind switching to the next slide. And just going back to the notion of data, right? To that topic, I said earlier, I'm very data driven, and once I make a change in my classroom, I want to make sure that the change is justified in order for me to continue with that transition ongoing, right? So the best way that I can afford myself, the foresight to do that, to continue with some sort of implementation, whether it's simulations or it's a technique in my lecture room, is through the data. And so I wanted to put this table up to just kind of show you all what I found, what my experiences were using the simulations at USJ. And at first glance, when you look at this, you might be as disgruntled and surprised as I was. When I first started to put the data together, in order to even justify this transition to my administration and this ongoing integration, I was baffled. I saw these numbers and I got a little startled, because in my head, I was expecting to see grades transition and an uptick in leaps and bounds from before the integration. Because I was just so excited about integrating these simulations, and I thought the data would equally validate that. And when I first looked at the numbers, I wasn't satisfied. I was disgruntled almost, to the point where I literally took my data and I brought it to my department chair and I said, look, Irene, I need your help. What do you see here? What are these numbers telling you about this, the impact of simulations in my classroom? Because I'm not happy with it. And she looked at it and she said, Christina, I see that, if I can draw some sort of correlation from the numbers, correlation, right? Not causation, but some sort of correlation here. I see that, if we're thinking about this change, I see that, your students weren't negatively impacted by the simulations. Their grades were either status quo or even a slight uptick in numbers to really truly justify that, this change that you're doing, this added implementation is helping, right? And so I was happy with that. I saw that, in fact, the data was in fact telling me in some ways that these simulations were helping. But I still wasn't fully satisfied, being data driven. So I did want to really engage the students further in terms of their insights and perspectives on the Sims. And so I stumbled on, I didn't even realize that this was part of the simulation until I realized that in fact, there's a portion of, there's an opportunity for the students when they're running through these simulations to really provide their perspective on it, right? And so I saw that, the student's perspective was a good one. And so I wanted to put this table up here today because it indicates the pie charts are showing the progress, the feedback that I was gaining from the students throughout the semesters following the integration. And I was utilizing this information to help me decide whether or not I was going to continue with further implementation. And so the overarching question that students were asked at the end of their simulations was, how they felt about the simulation. Did you gain relevant knowledge while running through the simulation? And so what I was really excited about was the fact that these students were overwhelmingly responding in a positive way. So they were, in fact, feeling in their gut that they were having a good experience, right? And it wasn't a contrived response because the students knew that these questions and their answers were all anonymous. It wasn't very much like I would ask when I would just kind of sample the students in the classroom and say, hey, what do you think about Lapster? It's okay, it's good, I like it. I felt almost as though that anecdotal evidence that I was collecting, systematically throughout the semester was more contrived just simply because the students wanted to, please their professor, right? They wanted to say the right answer. It's all great. It's working out great. But this table here indicates, plucking me out of the situation, how does my student feel when they're done with a simulation? And I was happy to see that resoundingly so, they felt that they gained some sort of knowledge from the sim. And just to see in terms of the scope of the pie charts, the green, the lime green, the forest green are the positive responses. And something that I'm noticing a happy trend is even as we progress from spring 21 to spring 23, I see that the not so satisfied, the unsatisfactory perspective is also decreasing. So it was a really good reason, justification to inspire me to continue and move forward with the simulations. And so if you could go on to the next one. So I realized, I think maybe of course, why that red in the pie chart was decreasing as we progressed from one semester to the next. It could possibly correlate to how I was communicating my message to my students, right? We learn every semester as educators, and we evolve and we do things differently so that we can maximize engagement and interest and excitement from our students. And I realized as I progressed from one semester to the next with these simulations that it was critical to communicate with my students the why. Why do you have to go through these simulations? Why are there 4 exams in the class? Why are there lab exams? One notable transition that I found in my learners that really truly signified the demarcation between secondary education and adult learners was that need to know the why, right? So that they can justify personally, this is what I'm doing. This is I can add value to this assessment as a student. And so I started talking about that with my students, the why. And that really allowed them to get on board and excited about these activities that they were doing. Something else that I found that's so critical is to set realistic expectations, not just for the students, but for ourselves. We can't put the bar so high that it becomes arduous for us to get there, right? We don't want to become physically and emotionally exhausted when we're just at the beginning of the semester, for example, right? We want to set realistic expectations for all of us involved in the classroom. And so I realized that this is something that's important to do with these simulations. And or with any sort of integration that you're doing, be it in the lecture or the lab, setting that bar to be attainable. And finally, this ability for our students, which lends back to the why question, to see, that the content isn't just driven by my desire to teach you this particular topic. I love this topic and I want you to learn about it, but it's driven by my impetus to prepare you for your real life experience, your real future goals. And for my students, those were, they're going to land themselves in a clinical environment, in a clinical setting. And so these simulations allowed them to experience that ahead of their time when they do end up in their clinicals, be it as nurses or farm students or PA students. And so allowing them to see those connections between, their present as a student, as a learner, versus their future as a clinician really also helped get them on board and excited as to, where I'm going with these assessments. If you don't mind, thank you. So of course, there's always barriers, right? I wish that everything was puppies and rainbows, but it's not. We have challenges that we have to overcome. I think that's where sharing our experiences is so important. And I'm so grateful to APS to allow me to do that, right? To share my experiences and where I found pitfalls and barriers and how I overcame them, but also you've all afforded me that opportunity to learn from you as well, right? Because we don't exist in a vacuum, even though COVID kind of made us feel that way. We do exist in a collaborative environment where we can share and see how we can learn from our past and our mistakes. So some barriers that I found were cost, right? So it was terrific that this particular platform didn't require, equipment and space to place that equipment. And so the cost, for the administration was minimal. But after I was able to go through certain administrative support to initially engage in the platform, and then a few grants that I was able to successfully harness in order to help my students, there still was this cost that was incurred on the students. But what I realized was that in my experience and in my goals in the classroom was I've been trying to do my best throughout the several years that I've had the blessing of teaching is to make the experience holistically better for my students. And so part of that is cost. And so I had transitioned before this simulation, this integration, I had transitioned to what we call low cost, no cost course materials, which really helped overcome the barrier of cost. And what I found was even with simulations integrated in the mandate of course materials that are purchased by my students, the cost of all of the course materials combined was still significantly less than it was before the simulations when I was using traditional platforms for text and lab manual. So, there's always different ways that you can circumvent some of these barriers, which was really kind of wonderful. Issues experienced during the simulations was another barrier that at first seemed daunting to me because I would get emails from students saying, hey, it's not working. What do I do? And at first I struggled to figure out, okay, what are you using on your PC? What does it look like? And then I realized, well, wait a minute, Christina, I'm not the IT specialist, nor do I have to. The students aren't IT specialists, nor do they have to be. There's ways to overcome these issues. And the challenge of overcoming it on behalf of the student was yet another skill that I realized they were going to acquire from this, right? Learning that, okay, I am having trouble right now with this particular simulation. It's sticking on me quite literally. I need to figure out my way out of this. And so what I realized that process in and of itself was a skill that my students gained, albeit very unhappily so, while they were in the thick of it, right? They weren't too amused with the fact that I couldn't just press a button from my perspective and resolve it. But I realized when they did navigate their way through with the support from the platform, they were more excited that they were able to resolve it. They would come in the next day and say, "Hey, Dr. A, you know what? This simulation was sticking on me, but I went into your folder and I found the resources that I need, and I got out of it. I resolved it." And they were excited even about that, even about overcoming what usually would have been seen as just a frustration. So they were gaining some experience there in terms of problem solving. And the point that I want to leave off with is, before we move on to the next slide is, and still the data persists, that these simulations, even in spite of these barriers, this new modality of resolving the physiological deficit, the data does support that this is a great resolution, and one that, in spite of these barriers, is persistently so, as far as the data is concerned. So take-home messages, what I realized, of course, again, during COVID, we didn't have that opportunity to just take things slow, right? But now that we're all in a healthy and new normal, I've realized that you can take changes slowly, right? I know from my own experience, sometimes I just get so excited about doing something new that I just want to add it in there and do it wholeheartedly and integrate it right away. But I've realized that that doesn't always pan out well for all of us, right? I mean, I'm sure out of all of you folks, New Year's resolutions, January is great for getting those resolutions in and really, jumping on that bandwagon and going out there and exercising and eating healthy. But, there are pitfalls in that, right? So I realized that, with whatever change I'm making in my classroom or laboratory, what I've learned from the changes I've already made is that it's totally okay to take it slowly, to make these changes in piecemeal. One thing that I learned through this course that I took in Universal Design for Learning is just that we want to evolve. We want to evolve our methods and modalities for content dissemination. We want to improve our student experiences and their engagement and their retention, but we don't have to do 120%. We can do it in piecemeal, and those small changes have big impact. And this change, in terms of my integration of simulations, I can validate that they had that it did have a positive impact on my students. It maximized their critical thinking, whether it was simple troubleshooting problems versus deciding how to analyze that CBC or that EKG. It increased their excitement and their zest for knowledge and engagement. And according to the data and the grades, also content retention. It a significant number of students improved in terms of their successful completion of the year of anatomy and physiology. So these are a few of my take-home messages that I found, not just with this integration, but in general, changes that I've made throughout the years in terms of an evolutionary process of what my classroom looks like today versus 2004 when I first started teaching. And so, something that I wanted to put this slide in here, I think, because again, I feel like as educators, we do love research, right? And so I think it's important that I emphasize the fact that, I didn't just come up with this on my own, oh my goodness, I don't have enough physiology in the laboratory. I'm going to integrate simulations. It required a lot of front loading in terms of research and seeing what others in our field are doing, right? Because this problem wasn't just my own. It was, it was experienced by so many others in the STEM fields. And so I was excited to see how they were resolving the problem. What were they doing, And so that's when this whole journey for simulations began, with me just diving in the research and reading what other educators are doing. And I was excited to see that simulations were a resounding solution for a lot of the issues that were out there. Honestly, I was excited to see that I wasn't the only one experiencing the problems that I was experiencing. It's often, you can get into when, you're stuck in your office and you can feel a little bit gloom and doom, thinking that it's just you, what am I going through here? But diving into the research allows you to see that others are going through the same thing, and also opportunities to mitigate those problems and just really look forward to resolution. And I found that the simulations were substantiated in the research as well, and in various fields, not just the STEM fields. I saw in terms of sports management and business, I was seeing these the substantiation in the research. And so I figured it'd be great if, I know, April, you were saying that you were going to provide this for folks to see just some examples.
Definitely, most definitely, you'll receive it after the presentation's over.
Yeah, and just to see, because there's so many different opportunities. And again, it's not just in the STEM fields. There's a lot of other fields where simulations are becoming a good faith implementation to really help amplify our courses.
Okay. Here we are at the question portion of our presentation. I'm going to stop my share of the screen so that we can take a look at any questions that have come in and see what we can answer. All right. See any Q&A? Okay, so Aaron Babakar says, thank you for your innovating teaching efforts. I'm curious and wish to know your opinion about the following. What will be the reaction perception of students when exposed to only simulation-based teaching versus combined simulation-based teaching and in-person-based teaching versus only in-person-based teaching?
Oh, that's a really good question. Thank you. It's interesting because part of the wonderful part, a big part of why I love teaching at USJ is because it's a small college, which means that I do have this ability to see students later, as after they leave A&P and move on to their next courses, right? And they come back because I have this open door policy. Talk to me, tell me how things are going. And so I've had the opportunity to chat with students who were fully in person, chat with students that I never actually physically met in person because they were fully remote, and then those that returned afterwards. And I found that overwhelmingly, they were excited about this integration. What I did find was that, which makes absolute sense, they would never want to go back to the fully remote. The majority of them really did want some interaction. We all need that. We crave that, that company, that collaboration. And so looking at these different responses and the transitions that all of us have undergone throughout the years, I feel as though the most satisfying of all of the different modalities was one where it's kind of like a hybrid mix, where you get a little bit of the best of both worlds in terms of what you're doing. You have the laboratory experience, but you also have the at-home comfort zone of pulling up your content and working on it on your own.
Very good. Thank you for that answer. And then We have another great question from Ian Murray at the new Alice Walton School of Medicine, and I think it's in Bentonville, Arkansas, but I may be getting that wrong. Thank you for this presentation. What are your thoughts on the TPAC model, technology, pedagogy, and content? Sometimes technology can outweigh the other aspects. And Ian shares a link, which is kind of hard to take a look at right now, but do you have any thoughts on that model?
Yeah, actually, I feel like everything needs to be approached with some sort of balance, right? We don't want one modality to supersede another, right? I know that at certain times throughout the last few years, we had no choice, right? But I feel as though technology is good to the point of, amplifying, adding to the course, but not in lieu of the full-on in-person experience. And what I liked about, and I'm speaking on, in terms of what we do at my university, we kind of marry the two, right? So we have simulations that we use that we've started using from A&P and on, where in my world, they're working on the computer. They are getting their experience in terms of various clinical settings. And then when they go to their upper division courses, they have simulations that are now transitioning them more to in-person. So what do I mean by that? Now they have their patients and they're working with mannequins that are simulating various conditions. So they've seen it on the computer. Now they're seeing it in terms of, okay, here's a quote unquote patient and how I'm going to resolve. And then from there, they move on to actual clinical care. So I feel like technology shouldn't replace, the in-person experience. It should be used mindfully. It should be integrated mindfully, but not in lieu of the actual clinical experience that these students are needing, but also craving. So we have to be mindful of that balance that we need to strike between one and the other. Because I do worry about, how far technology can go. But I think we have to emphasize the need for that person-to-person communication, the collaboration amongst our students in the real world.
And then we have, well, thank you for that answer. We do have another question from Lisa, and the question has to do with approximately how long does a simulation take for students to complete? And I'd like to invite you to answer, but also invite my colleague, Dan Elfman from Labster to come up and also give an answer if he so desires. So you take it away, Christina.
Yeah, so what I've noticed was, these simulations can take anywhere from, 25 or so minutes, correct me if I'm wrong, to maybe about 45 minutes. The students can really have some ownership over the time because, depending on how quickly they get through the questions, the answers, but there is a time frame that they have for overall how long they're going to be taking. And that's where I noticed too that it's important to, emphasize and remind them that, you got to plan. You can't just do this like, okay, it's due at the end of the week by midnight. You can't just sit down at 11:30 in the evening and expect to do 2 simulations. So that in and of itself has helped them to figure out trial by error. Okay, I need to think about things and I need to be more thoughtful about my calendar in terms of how long it's going to take. But Daniel, can you add to that?
Really well said, Christina. I think honestly, anywhere on the absolute low end, 5 to 10 minutes, and then the most lengthy simulations are about 50 minutes. But I'd say the absolute average, what you should really anticipate, is anywhere from like 25 to 40 minutes is really where the bulk of our like amount of time that it takes to complete a simulation.
And
And
Dan, maybe, pardon me, Christina, go ahead.
Sorry. So for those of you folks who are teaching, who maybe you're teaching classes over the summer as well, again, there's always a balance, right? So at St. Joe's, we have 2 6-week courses. We have A&P 1 during summer session 1, 6 weeks, and then A&P 2 during summer session 2. And it's a challenge because we need to have that contact time for the laboratory experience. But, so we dive into it in the laboratory in terms of anatomy, but they still have that experience at home through simulations, which truly helps provide a robust experience in terms of a summer session course. So sure, it's 6 weeks, but I feel like technology is allowing us to really kind of allow for time to really be taken advantage of in this case, so that they can successfully complete an A&P 1 or 2 course in the summer. As far as I feel, as far as my opinion and assessment is concerned, that is comparable to a typical semester because of this technology. So again, it's a balance, I think, about how far you're going to take it.
And then you had mentioned, I am going to go on to one last question, but first I wanted to just touch on something you mentioned in your last response, and that was how you have assigned and scheduled assignments to be due at a certain time. Are you integrating simulations with your learning management system? And if so, which one do you use and how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, great question. So I like that it's a bit seamless. So, our learning management system is Blackboard. And so I worked with my colleagues in the Learning Resource Center, and we were able to, add this in to our courses. And so it's for the student, it's a really big asset. They go right there into their course shell, and they're able to click on and go through the simulations. But I have realized that in my head, sometimes what's going to work doesn't always translate into actually working out, So I found out the hard way, the answer to your question earlier about the amount of time that it takes for a simulation, because I realized, like, geez, I can't be assigning so many here because I'm excited about them doing them, that their entire week is consumed with simulations, because then it really does become defeating for the students. So I realized, like, there's a balance in terms of how much you're going to assign, and really, combing through the simulations and the options to see what do you want your students to glean from this particular simulation. How does it translate back, like everything else that we do in our classroom, to our course objectives? What do you want them leaving with? So it's, again, trial and error, and having the ability to do that from one semester to the next always helps, because then you modify.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Mithri. It says, I teach anatomy and physiology to students of health psychology. Do you think this tool will be useful for them? And then there's an additional thought. I'd like to add that these students might not need the depth of knowledge as would be needed for medical students. So do you have a scaled down version or a simplified version of the simulator that we could use?
That's a great question. I do think it would be very helpful. What I have found is that some of these simulations, especially in Anatomy 1, so let me reframe this. So in Anatomy 1, my students are enrolled. They have just completed an intro bio course, right? And they're very nervous. They're very scared. Their whole goal is, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? And how am I going to get that 80 that I need to stay within my program, right? And so they're very worried. And sometimes, unfortunately, that worry does supersede, their successful navigation of their journey, right? And so what I found was that these simulations, some of them are scaled down in terms of content. Some of them are, at least in this platform, they work in segments. So for example, there's a microscope one that has 3 parts to it. Do I need all of my kids to know, all of my students to know how to use an electron microscope? No, not necessarily. So I'm not going to assign that part. So you can assign pieces that you feel will be most suitable to your course outcomes. And the other part to this that I liked was that it provides, there's theory there that they have to begin with before they actually go to the clinical portion of working with the patient or working on a lab setup. So the theory provides the foundation that they need to gain the confidence to move forward within the simulation. So between all of that and just kind of trial and error, figuring out which ones are the best, I think it would be terrific. And I don't feel, I feel that these simulations are up to par with, depending on which ones that you assign, they're up to par with a 100s level course, a 200s level course, even a 300s level college course. So depending on picking and choosing. But again, the take home message that I realized that I found was the most helpful for me, and I still do it, is by playing with it. So acting as that student and just navigating through a simulation to see, all right, is this really what I'm looking for? Is this a bit much for my audience, or is this not enough? So playing with it is, the trial and error part is really important.
Love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we have time for just one more question from Syed Muhammad, who says, thank you for this lecture and sharing your experience. I have a question which might not correlate with the current topic, but I just want to ask you that while taking a lecture, we have a bunch of students of varying understanding levels. So what should be the approach to teach them, like coming to the level of the most weakest student? And in this scenario, we would end up taking a lot more time. I'll be thankful to your valuable suggestion.
Wonderful. And I'm glad I'm not the only one that experiences that. It's a struggle, right? You have these students that are enrolled in your course. And what I found especially difficult is when I have 40 or 50 students in my class, it's really hard to see where they're coming from in terms of their foundational knowledge. At what level are they? And it becomes difficult. It becomes a challenge, right? But this is where I realized lecture is not the great way of doing this. Active learning is. That's one part of it. So, because nobody wants, except for me, I love talking, right? But I love listening to myself, but, the students don't, So I noticed that one way to get past that, where these students are coming from and their foundational knowledge, is doing just little small lecture bursts, like maybe a 5-minute lecture. And because at the end of the 5 or 10 minutes, you will lose them. And then moving away from that to active learning, group work, because here's the thing, within a group, your students are going to find where they have their challenges and where they shine, and they're going to support each other, right? So having it's even possible in a lecture room. My class is taught in this amphitheater lecture space, which it's not conducive to, you'd think it just doesn't make sense with active learning. It's conducive to the talker at the front, but we figure out a way. And I have my kids literally say, I say to them, like, move around. If you want to sit on the floor, you want to sit on the steps, you're going to find a couple of people to your right, to your left, behind you, and you're going to sit and work with them. It fosters friendships, which I think is important because these students are going to be working with the same students as they progress in their experiences at the school, right? And in their program. So it fosters friendships and collaborations, but it also mitigates some of those nerves and challenges. I'm scared, I don't get this. Well, wait, I don't get it either, but I think I heard this, and I think she said this. So the group effort, the group work is really something that I'm finding is a really not just a substitute for lecture and traditional modality for teaching, but an asset that helps. And it doesn't always go great, but I realized, you know what? That's okay too. Who cares? It doesn't have to always be perfect. I found myself, like, some days when I'm doing these little lecture bursts and group efforts, that they work out great, and I leave the classroom beaming, thinking that it was just such a phenomenal experience. And other days I think to myself, whoa, what was I thinking? Right. And then you share with your colleagues and they say the same thing. So it's okay for all of us to make those mistakes and learn from them. But I think active learning is what's going to help us, figure out where these students are coming from and get them all on the same level in terms of their knowledge moving forward so that they can successfully complete the course.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's just been an absolute privilege to hear all of your answers to these questions and your wonderful presentation. I know we probably have a lot more questions that we could answer, so let me see if I can just share our slides one more time and have the contact information available. I don't know if you can see, I'll try to put it in slideshow mode. There you go. So this is how to reach Christina after the presentation, and also how to reach us at Labster, my colleague Siley, who's been in the chat.
Oh, and you guys, please do. Anybody who wants to, not just about simulations, but in general, if you have some great idea that you're using in your class, please share it. I'd love to hear it and you know, pilot it in my own classroom. I think that's what's so great about us educators. We can always learn and we want to learn. We're excited. So I'd love to learn from you. So please do reach out to me if you'd like to chat a little bit more and have the conversation ongoing.
Thank you so much. We completely share your feelings. And Jacob, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you so much, April, and thank you, Dr. Alevras, for your great insights. Just thank you to the audience for attending today. And before you do leave, we ask that you complete a brief survey about today's session, but also other physiology education topics you'd like to see us cover. So with that, thank you so much again, and have a great day, everyone. Take
Thank you,
care.
everybody, and happy spring semester and happy new year.